Killing it. Okay, cool. So, hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm sure there's going to be people joining us as we get started. I'm Jenny Bard, if you don't know me, educator and currently really proud friend of Rachael Balbarona. So, I met Rachael 8 years ago, 7 years ago. It's been a while. It was 2013, right?
2013,
Yeah.
yeah, 7 years ago.
Yeah, so I met Rachael 7 years ago. She was one of our first Teach for America core members in Eastern Washington. Um, and she has just been killing it ever since. She started out as a teacher and in Washington State, went on to get her master's degree from UW, and has been a Teach for America staff member, a summer Teach for America staff member. She's been to Atlanta, and now she's living it up in New York. And she has some really amazing things to say today about a bunch of different topics, but we're hoping to talk on ableism, colonial mindsets, and just things that schools and educators can do to like be more supportive of all children. So I'll let Rachael give a little bit of introduction about herself, and then I'll sort of frame what our talk's going to be about today.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. We did meet 7 years ago. Like that's just like, oh my gosh, what? Like our friendship is nearing a decade. Like, wow. Um, that's wow. That's like a third of my life. What? But no, I just yeah, no, thank you. First of all, thank you for this opportunity. I think I'm really excited about it. Also a little nervous, but I think it's just like these are the conversations we need to be having, right? And it's just so important. So a little bit about myself. Like what you said, right? Did Teach for America, did some work there, taught in Eastern Washington. Shout out to the squad. 13, yes, that was us. We from there, spent a little bit of time in Seattle. I worked with Upward Bound for a little bit, working in high school and just like college access and readiness. Realized that, high school is not necessarily for me. They're just I admire all middle school and high school teachers. Absolutely. Oh my goodness. That's such amazing work. And also I think I was just really intimidated. I was like, oh my gosh, they're all so much taller than me. They're all also just I think a lot of like the students, I think I was pretty young then too, right? I was like really close in age with them, and so it's just like navigating that. From there, went down to Atlanta. Was an intervention ELL interventionist. Taught fourth grade. Came up over here, taught third grade. Also was an interventionist, and then just most recently moved into my new role as the director of student support services. Essentially, it's the director of special education at my school. I currently work at a charter school here in Harlem, and just learning all things special ed and just like navigating going out of the classroom, being a little bit more removed from the kids, but still working in a school setting. And then also just like the structures of like leadership, I think is some of the big things that's really most recently helped me think about just our roles as schools, with students, serving students of color, and my specific role in that too. A little bit, wow, that was like a big
No, that was great. There's a lot to get into.
yeah, definitely. A little bit about myself. I am a military brat. My dad was in the military. I identify as a Filipino American, also as an immigrant. I was born in the Philippines, moved to the States at a pretty young age. And I think a lot of that has also just like factored into just like who I am today. So.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, thanks for giving that introduction. When we were talking about the theme for today's talk, there were so many different things that came up, and we finally honed into to a few different things, and I threw out the idea of like let's call it walking and chewing gum at the same time, and like talk about a few of those bullets that we want to get to. And so I just wanted to explain the metaphor to folks who might be hearing that and being like, oh, what is that?
Oh, you're breaking up a little bit, Jenny. I think you're frozen. Or am I frozen? Let me text you. Jenny, are you there? Am I frozen? Are you frozen? Oh, I think I see you moving, but I can't hear you now. Okay. Jenny just texted me. We are going to restart the Zoom. Technical difficulties, BRB. See you guys very, very soon.
We're
Hey,
back.
we're back.
Well, hey everyone, and thanks for sticking with us as we dive into the very real world of technology.
Yep.
Um, I've never had that happen before. It was like there's a problem in Zoom and your audio needs to restart, and I was like, oh my God. But apparently, problem solved. Moved to a different room. Um, so walking and chewing gum at the same time. Deary McKesson said that recently on, or he says it a few times on his podcast, Pod Save the People. And essentially the idea is like, you know, sometimes when we talk about these issues of identity and inequity, people can get caught up in, well, I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to talk about this instead. So you might see that in feminist circles as people not wanting to be intersectional feminists. They want to talk about just feminism and discrimination against women without realizing that we can do both at the same time. We can advocate for our own needs as women and also say like, and women of color face a series of different challenges, and people who are not cisgender or people who have different gender identities, we need to advocate for that too. So that came to mind for me when thinking about all of the things that you are doing and want to talk about with ableism and colonial mindsets, and just like making sure that students have their humanity when they come to school. So with that in mind, walking and chewing gum at the same time, what do you think of when you think of that phrase? And then we'll dive into some of our like topics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think again, just like intersectionality is so huge in this work and the work that we do, right? And that in many spaces, it's important to go and like name those things and what we identify as, what we're going through, all of those different things, but then also know that like the very privileges that come along with some of those. And I think in a lot of the work that we've done, Jenny, in like identity work, like we see that show up where it's like, oh, okay, right now we're going to be talking about race, but then others latch on to oh, but I was also poor, or oh, but I also had this experience, or oh, I've done this as well. And I think I've even found myself doing that where I'm like, oh, like this thing has happened to me, but it's like, actually, Rachel, it's not about you right now, right? And just like again taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, right? And also like knowing and recognizing that yes, there are parallels to just like those experiences, but we still need to continue doing the work, right? I think that's just what I'm thinking about there.
Yeah, cool. So let's start off with, you know, you're someone who is passionate about social justice, you're passionate about race and a variety of other issues. Like, and this is a journey, right? Like we all start at different places and have different experiences along the way. What are some of the things that got you thinking about social justice or thinking about racism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thinking about race, right? I think as a Filipino American, like that's something I've always thought about, right? Like that's just something like at the forefront for me. But not always being able to go and name that and not having the vocabulary to go and name that. I think you see that quite a bit, especially in like within the Filipino culture and in the Asian American community. And so I think that's where, yeah, I'm thinking about race. This is always something just kind of like at the forefront. However, I think the time when I really had to think about my own identity and how my identity relates to the rest of the world, I think it started off in college and then really was pushed during my time in Teach for America when we started doing the identity work. And I think along with that, it was just like intentional work of like thinking about myself, thinking about just like my own experiences. I think at that time too, in 2013, like Mike Brown happened, right? And that was like a huge thing for me too. And just thinking about like how am I showing up teaching? At the time I was, in Mattawa, like teaching students who are immigrants, right? And migrant families, but then also moving into other spaces where I am teaching Black children. And how am I, this person who does not identify and as Black, right? Showing up, and then what is my role in teaching Black and Brown children? And I
Mm-hmm.
think those are some of the things that I started with. I think again, my experience is just like within education, just like interactions, right, with like coworkers, colleagues, negative and positive ones, families, students. Like all of that has really like shaped to where I am today, and then where I'm gonna, like, obviously I'm continuing to think about in my role. I think also just having all the different experiences, as you know, like Jenny, I started off in like rural Washington State. I've also down in Atlanta, I've taught in the suburbs, right? In Seattle, being in a city with a lot of urban sprawl, and then now in New York City, where it is extremely urban. I think all of those different experiences has really made me think about how race is how race shows up in all of those spaces, how it can be very different, but then there's always common themes within that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, just like those inequities that we continue to go and see. And so I think that and then I think most recently with everything that has been happening with COVID, and also with like the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's happening right now, I've really just been thinking about like what is, I think in many ways, right, this work can feel really, you can we can feel like we're getting jaded, right, because this work is hard.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's like reevaluating and thinking about, okay, like what are the spaces and where are the areas where I can make changes? What are some systems around me
Mm-hmm.
where I can definitely go and do that? And so I think the very first thing for myself was thinking about, again, just like within my own like Filipino American community, like the Asian American community, and that's where I started thinking about just like the colonial mindsets that is so deeply rooted in just like within my community, and then how that also relates to, and how that's so deeply embedded, and how it relates to just like the racism, and then like the internalized like oppression that we have then now are just going through, right? So that's kind of where I'm at there.
Yeah.
Good answer.
And I think that that bleeds into something else that I know we were hoping to talk about. So I've heard that you use the phrase a couple times, white colonial mindsets within the Filipino community. Um, I could use a little bit more explanation, maybe an example, and I'm sure other folks who are tuning in could as well. Like, what do you mean by that? What are some examples? And like, what are your thoughts on how we combat it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so like colonial mentality, it's again very deeply rooted in the Filipino culture. It's essentially just like the rejection of anything that's Filipino. And I think for
Mm,
us, it's like that response to the colonialization of like Spain when they colonized the Philippines for a good amount of time, and also when America colonized the Philippines for a good amount of time. And a lot of that is really just like the stripping of like the Filipino culture and saying, nope, Spanish culture, American culture is the way to go, right? And then all of
mhm,
these like very westernized views and mindsets came to the forefront, and so in order to survive as a means of survival, right? You
mm,
see a lot of like assimilation within the Filipino community of being like, okay, like in order to survive, these are the things that I have to go and do, and these I have to shed this part of myself. Um,
mhm,
and a lot of that, I guess, um, I mean, it's just so deeply rooted, right? I think a common misconception is like, oh, like this is what happens when you move to like America or move to
mhm,
another place, but it's like no, because we were colonized, and that's actually so deeply rooted within like generations and generations and generations, within like our grandparents, their parents, their great grandparents, all of that. And
mhm,
so some examples of that again is just really. really valuing anything that's Western. So just like there's a lot of colorism within the Filipino community, right? Whitening products. You know, like families, people, or like aunties, parents, right, saying, getting worried about you getting too dark, you know, when you're outside, right? And like, oh, why are you so dark? Or looking down on others for having darker skin, right? Or like, oh, you need to wear a sweater because if you wear a sweater, you're gonna get too dark. So again, there's just like mindset of that. And then also you see that within the media in the Philippines too, right? Like you look at the media and you look at who they view as beautiful, and they're very like light-skinned, westernized features, European features, and then those who they again deem as quote uncivilized, right? Where they oftentimes will talk about like Igorots, which is like the indigenous people, or one of many like indigenous people within the Philippines, and then you know, and then that is used as like a way to talk down to someone, or if you were to get called out, you know, different things like that. So again, it's like just rejecting anything Filipino, feeling embarrassed about anything like within the Filipino culture, the rejection of the Filipino history. I think many times, I think you see this a lot in a lot of Asian cultures. We don't talk about like our history. We don't talk about that. And again, it's like that mindset of like, oh, this is what we have to do to survive, or to do well, or to do better, right? So different things like that. Also, oh, ding dong. Also, just like the bootstraps mentality, right? If you work hard, you'll get what you want or what you need, but not taking into consideration the systemic structures that actually has been put in place to just like pin each other with pin other communities of color, or even within the Filipino community, pin us against each other, right? And so, and then I guess the last thing I would see within that is just like this crisis almost of developing an identity. I think that was like a big thing for me growing up. I was just like too white to hang out with the white kids. I was not Filipino enough to be with some of like the other like Filipino people, like kids in my school, you know, different things like that. And so it's just like this like lost sense of identity. Again, that's just so deeply rooted in that. And I guess, how do we address this? I think one, the conversation, which I'm seeing a lot of, again, in many of the spaces that we're in right now, especially on like social media, within friend groups, it's just like having that conversation. I'm thinking about how this would like show up in the classroom as well, because again, that's just like more of like, we're obviously like we're educators, that's where we're at. Like, how does that look like in the classroom? It's just like having conversations about race in your classroom. You know, when I taught kindergarten, that second year, yep, you know, Jenny, you coached me then. Those are conversations we can have with 5-year-olds. Like, it is not, it is something that we can do, and they are absolutely capable of doing, right? And then within the teaching practice, right, getting past the I don't see color type of mentality, but it's like, no, we need to like name our race, and we need to name like the different colors that we identify with, right? Black, brown, all of that. Because if we don't, it's really just like erasing just like the deep and beautiful history that we have. And then continuing to support like the white supremacist culture, or like what the majority is, and the majority is like what white culture, right? And then I think also it's just like doing the research, like as educators, and like how to combat that. It's just like, one, it's doing the identity work, right? If you are not able to go and have the conversation with your colleagues, or even sit down and think about it yourself, right? How are you going to go and do this type of conversation, this type of work in front of kids, right? I think that's huge. Obviously, like curriculum, right? Not just doing that at the surface level of like important leaders, but also going like discussing key events and how it relates to just like how we are now. And also just talking about not just traumatic ones, but also like excellence within our communities, right? I think that's huge. And then just like the family outreach, building the community, bringing the community in, I think is huge. And I think these are things that is just like we hear time and time again, or all the time, right? Like these are the things that we should do, but it's like, yet we're still not seeing it, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, those are
Yeah.
I'm thinking about.
Yeah, as you were talking, I definitely see a common thread in what you're talking about related to like one, knowing your own identity. So like as a white person, like knowing who I am, where I come from, the good and bad things that white folks have done to others throughout the course of history. But then also like taking the time to authentically build relationships with people. So like if I'm thinking about from the classroom perspective, like how am I building relationships with my students and their families and learning about their traditions and what they're proud of, and really elevating those things, right? Because I think in schools and in the classroom, I think a lot of teachers can get caught up in the mindset of like, it's my job to make sure that these kids learn this content so that they can pass the test and I can feel good about the percentages that I have.
Mm-hmm.
When what I hear you saying is like, school is a place where we can affirm and lift up everyone's identity, and we can teach how to see difference in a way that's productive and doesn't dehumanize people, but makes all of us better. So I'm really excited for the school that you're going to open someday.
I don't know if that's in the cards for me. We'll see. I don't know.
But you know, I think this is a conversation that educators don't really get to have, right? Like most of what administrators talk to teachers about tends to be like the content, like here's how you teach fractions and this cute little butterfly trick that you can do so that kids will remember it. But like that's not how learning happens, right? Like that's not how learning happens at the collegiate level. And you know, if educators on the call, you can read a variety of books. I highly recommend For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too by Dr. Christopher Emdin out of Columbia. It's a phenomenal book. Don't let the title make you uncomfortable, because if you're not building up your kids and if you're not building relationships, like if your families don't know your first name, you're probably not doing your job right. Is just like a truth that I've come to have. I also was thinking as you were talking, I know one of the things we're going to talk a little bit about is ableism, you know, being a special ed director and talking to another special ed director. It's so rare. But, you know, a lot of these same things are true through the lens of ability status, right? Like, I think one of my like entry points to empathy, if we're going to think about it that way, has been like, kids who are in special ed, we need to stop thinking about it as their brains are damaged. We need to stop thinking about, you know, similar to colonial mindsets, right? Like we need to stop thinking about like, how can you be like more like this like norm that we've held up and want you to be? And instead, how can we look at who you are, how you like sort of operate and engage with the world? And then like, how do we celebrate that? How do we help you? You know, because there's something like probably we're always going to have to work, unfortunately. so like how do we help you get to a place where you can develop the skill sets that make you ready? So as you head into this special ed directorship role and this leadership, how are you thinking about helping educators see their kids' talents, even if they have a disability?
Absolutely. I think that is I think a lot of it, first and foremost, is just like shifting the narrative, right? I think so much of special education has this like stigma that's like carried along with it, and I think it's so much of like this deficit model, essentially, right? And I know you were speaking to that a bit, but I think so much of that is where a lot of teachers kind of like start a lot of their work in, right? So if this student has this disability, I'm going to do these types of things, right? But I think, again, it's like shifting that mindset of like, okay, what are the things this student is really good at? Let's highlight that. Let's go and really take that. And how can we take those areas of strengths and areas of greatness, or areas that where the student has has really strong supports in, and use that to leverage and support the student within the classroom. So those are the things I think, again, is like the very first step that I am doing with my teachers, and just, you know, thinking about that. Really, again, it's just like that mindset shift, finding those specific pieces to go and support their students, and then using that to, yeah, again, just overall like support them within the classroom. Because I think that those beginning pieces are really, and those beginning mind shifts is again those first steps to like equity and whatnot. Yeah, but I would love to hear too, just like what you, I mean, you've been in like the special ed game much longer than me. Like, what are some things that you are, I guess, like doing with it, with your teachers? Also, yeah, what are you doing?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a big question, right? So this last year, well, for the last 3 years, I've been pretty focused on. So I moved to California. I've had the pleasure and very mind-numbing idea of doing special ed in 3 different states, right? So like 3 different state municipalities that have decided to focus the federal law in very different ways, right? But so I've just seen some different things play out. And I moved to California. Anyone who's in special ed right now will tell you, like, your focus is supposed to be on LRE, least restrictive environment. How are we getting kids into gen ed more?
Right, same here in New York, yep.
California, because of the way they structure their service model, makes it a little bit more challenging to do that. And or at least that is what schools and districts are saying. And you know, it's true, right? Like, inclusion is hard. But it's hard because it's different than how we were taught as children. It is not hard in the sense that it is impossible to do. So a lot of what I've been focused on over the last few years is some of the understanding by design work, or universal design for learning. That's what the L is. And thinking about, like, okay, well, what is it that you want the kids to do? Because I think we can get so focused on the micro of, like, okay, I want kids to be able to, like, compare statistical sets of data. And it's like, okay, so to do that, first they have to know what this is, and then this is, and then this is, and that's great. Yes, you should absolutely break it down. But also understanding, like, what's the actual big goal? Like, do you want to have a conversation with your kids about being able to evaluate different sets of data? Like, let's make it interesting. Let's make it real. Let's make it exploratory. And that's messy and it's hard. And also, you still have the responsibility of meeting those IEP goals and building up towards soft skills. So most of what I've been working on is helping people set up classroom models that do both, right? So like, I believe in centers from kindergarten through high school, and like getting that individual, like, what can kids do on their own and be proud of, and sort of develop that sense of efficacy and perseverance. And then, like, what do they really need an adult helping them deconstruct? And how can you use that teacher time and that insight that you have to really give valuable feedback? And then I think practically the thing I've been focusing on for the last several years that's given me the most bang for my buck is the accommodations page in the IEP. And just like using whatever the kid's last evaluation data was and looking at the actual subtests and saying, like, oh, Jenny has a really big deficit in her ability to parallel process. So like, you should not be expecting her to take notes and listen to you at the same time. Just give her the notes. Like, and just like finding those 4 to 5 accommodations that are really going to change the game, and then like training the teachers on them. Because when teachers feel like they helped come up with the accommodation, or they like understand the rationale, they are more motivated to do it. Because I think that's most of what it is. You know, teachers get overwhelmed and they're like, I don't have time to make 30 different lessons for kids every day. And it's like, well, I mean, no one's asking you to do that. And it's okay that you feel overwhelmed, but like, you know, it's also about like teaching the kid the accommodation so that the kid can do it. Because it's not that the teacher needs to do the accommodation, it's that the kid has to be able to do that thing that's different. And we
Right.
have to be okay with that.
Right.
So really it's more mindset training for the adults and then skill training mostly for the kid.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I'm saying the same thing too. It's just like building in that buy-in, right? I think, and it's not even that teachers aren't bought in. It's more so just like, again, echoing what you're saying. There's so much that a teacher has to go and do, and there's so many decisions that a teacher has to go and make that like another thing, just like it's just like feels so overwhelming. But it's actually like, well, one, it's an IEP, so it's a legal document. You have to go and follow it. But then also,
You
two,
have to. You
you
have
have
to.
to. You hear that, ladies and gentlemen. You have to go and follow it. But then also, too, like, how do we do it in a way that's going to feel manageable? And again, you have the student's best interest in mind, you know?
All right. So I think our last like big thing we're going to get to for the day, which we should make this a series because I could listen to you forever, but just keep that in your mind.
Yeah.
Thinking about like school systems, right? Because that's like the third big thing we wanted to talk about was like, what can schools do to positively impact change? So what are some of the like missteps you see schools make, and what are like some ideas you have for what systems could do to like make outcomes better for kids who historically have been marginalized, right? That might be kids of color, it might be students with disabilities, it might be students in poverty. Like there's a variety of lenses that folks could take into their local context, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of like missteps, right? I think there's a lot of things, right? There's a lot of work that needs to go and be done at first and foremost. I first of all, like education or the school system was not built for Black and brown people. It was not built for Black and brown children. So the system in itself was not made for us, right? It wasn't like that's the like reality of it. So then now it's like saying, okay, like because this system as a whole just like wasn't built for me, we have to go and break that down so much, right? And I think it just like in every single aspect within it, because again, it wasn't built for Black and brown children. There's so many parts of it that really, I guess you'll see so many missteps, whether it goes to testing, behavior management, the curriculum, like there was so much within it, right? That I think we really have to go and rethink and yeah. And I think the very first step is just like learning and identifying those like white supremacist culture. Yeah, the white supremacy within the school and within the workplace. And just like what are those characteristics, right? And I think that's going to be the very first step there is just like learning about it and identifying it, because like how can you go try and change these systems if you're not even really aware yourself, right? And then I think as schools it's just like acknowledging the systems that like, okay, yep, we messed up here, this is where it is, this is what's going on, and this like we need to go and like address it, right? And I think just making that known to the families too, that it's harmed, and that's in very many ways it's been very traumatic for our families and our students, right? And acknowledging that, I think an acknowledgement is the step, yeah, the very very first step. And then I guess afterwards, I would say it's just like rethinking the systems, and the people that are supporting it. So how are we going to go and adjust those systems, so that we're not doing it again? What are we going to go and do? And then when you're rethinking those systems, are the people who it's going to be affected a part of that conversation? And if they're not, they need to become a part of it, right? So that includes teachers, that includes families, that includes students. And I think, and again, like you see this a lot within like white supremacist culture, it's just that letting go of that power, and letting all stakeholders be a part of the conversation is what's really hard, because again, it's holding up this very like white supremacist system. And that means that like that person who is in power, those people who are in power aren't going to go and have that. And so it's knowing and realizing that. And I think some of that, again, it's just like rethinking the systems, creating new systems. Some of that is also recognizing that like, if you as a person has been a part of this organization for a very long time and you haven't been good for those families, it's just like recognizing, okay, that actually I need to, maybe I need to take a step back. Maybe I shouldn't be a part of this, and realizing that and being okay with that, because it actually has caused a lot of harms within our communities, right? And then I think finally the last thing is just like creating systems for accountability within all of those systems, and it's just like and normalizing it. I think that a lot of what I am seeing now within like my school and really schools just like everywhere, and just like teacher friends that I've been talking to, there's been a lot of this talk of like change, and like this feeling of like urgency of having to go and do that, but a lot of it is very reactionary to the different events that happen in our world, when really like what we need is a system where we're constantly thinking about that and not reacting, and we need systems that are also holding everyone accountable, teachers, administration, all of that, and also finding a way where teachers, families, students, in particular teachers, families, and students of color don't feel like, or don't have that fear of retaliation as well, right? And just, again, if we have that system for accountability, we will continue to go and get better and be better, and continue to think about, again, like the system and restructuring the system.
Yeah, that all totally makes sense. As you were talking, I was thinking about the need to just understand what folks' relationship with school has been like, right? Because you're right, like schools were founded on the idea of producing factory workers, and curriculums have been decided, standards have been decided that say, here's what's important to learn, and here's what percentage of kids we think should be successful. And then for these other groups of kids, we care about growth, but like we don't actually do anything in schools usually that like matches that in terms of supporting kids in that pathway. So I think when I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking about the need for all of us to take on the mindset that like we can do better. Like there is no place in teaching where you can be like, okay, I reached every single kid, I'm done, I don't need to do my job anymore. It's about like giving students and families the agency to say like, here are the goals I have for myself, here's what I want to accomplish, and then like go. And then it's also about when families are facing additional burdens or hardships, how are schools being positioned to help them? Because we're the ones that are held accountable for their outcomes.
Right.
And how do we put some of that maybe off of schools, right? So at my last school, I helped open a school-based health clinic because I was tired of seeing kids not have access to healthcare, be sick, unable to focus on learning. And that's not me making excuses for them. If they were in Miss Bard's class, they were still going to learn. But like, but I also am a human being who can see like, oh, honey, you don't feel good. Or like, ooh, you are having some real mental health problems. And like, as a teacher, like it's not my job to be your therapist. But like, as someone who loves and cares about you, I know that that's going to get in the way of you being successful. So we need to figure out a way to tie that in. So really, I think what we have decided today, and whoever is the next president, feel free to tap us for a co-Department of Education head. We'll be better than Betsy.
Yes.
and like, how do we rethink the idea of community supports, and like, how do we create the idea of community schools that were founded by the community for the community, and get rid of this notion of the bell curve, right? Like, it's not okay that there are 2 standard deviations below and we let some kids be that, right? Like, and we can't get into that mindset. Yeah, I think one of the other missteps we haven't talked about yet, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on, is school. Some charter schools have been in the news lately for rethinking how they do discipline with children of color, with their demerits and things like that. I know that's something that I've really struggled with. I think I'm a pretty big champion of PBIS, positive behavior interventions, and naming expected behaviors, but doing it through a culturally relevant lens, which, like, I don't necessarily see a whole lot of people doing well right now, but I think, like, I'm confident that we'll get there as a society. But a lot of people don't see the difference between PBIS and then like these systems that are really like behavior value judgment systems. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think yeah, I think a lot of the conversations, especially within like the charter school community, but also I've seen it in public schools as well, is again this just like view of how to again essentially it's like manage and control Black and brown bodies, right? A lot of the practice is around that, right? And I think there are pages on Instagram, Twitter, that are at all of the different social medias that are calling it out, because it's like enough is enough, right? And I'm thinking about them, and as I look through them, like you know, even my own charter network that I'm currently working for, like they have their own page as well, right? They and other charter networks around here. I mean, like let's be like, I'll name the ones here in New York City, right? Like we have Success Academy, we have Democracy Prep, we have KIP, we have the Uncommon. We have so many here that really follow on this model. And again, thinking about now, like the leaders coming out and saying, hey, like, yeah, we realize that we are not, our previous practices haven't been good and haven't had like the student at the forefront. And we realize how messed up it is. I think in very many ways it feels, I think, similar to what I was talking about earlier, reactionary, right? To all of this, because it's like, all of these things have been happening, and the community, whether it be your teachers, your students, or your families, have been trying to have the conversation. You just have been choosing not to, right? So again, it's that sense of like feeling like you have this power, and then this power is so deeply rooted in this idea or notion of, oh, I know what's best for you, and it's like, actually you don't, right? Especially because a lot of the leaders of these like different charter schools and many different public schools as well, again, are white people who are serving Black and brown communities. So you actually don't know, right? And I think that's why, like, for decades, like this conversation hasn't been happening, because it's like, again, trying to hold that power of thinking that oh, I know what's best, when like really that's not the case. And I think now that they're trying to go and do it, it's like now they're like getting placed on the hot seat, and I think, am I glad it's happening? Absolutely. The time is now, right? But I also think about, then again, similarly, if this is something that has been happening but you haven't been choosing to, like, maybe you're not the best person for the seat. Maybe you got to go and step down. Maybe that means reparations. Maybe that means, you know, like there's so many different things. I think my mind is still trying to grapple with, because it really is like, this is the now, and this is what's going on. This is what's happening. And I think conversations around that is going to continue to happen. And I am so happy that it is happening, right? And I also think that I am excited to see what's going to come out of it. I am hopeful, but I also think that's going to be a big shift for a lot of the current leaders within these positions. So, I mean, that's what it's looking like over here. Again, I can mainly speak about like what's happening in the charter world here in New York City right now, but I'd imagine similar things are happening in the public schools as well.
Yeah, I would say in some pockets of the country we're not having that conversation yet, but I'm hopeful we will.
That's true. I think, you know, if I ever thinking about like where I was teaching down south, I think that would have been the case as well, right? It would have been something that was looked over. And yeah, no conversation would be happening. We're just gonna go, they would have just gone on with like the day to day. So, you know, you're right.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's about like, yes, let's feel some excitement that those things are happening. And all right, so now you said you're going to do that. We're going to hold you accountable for making sure you follow through on that action. We're watching.
Right. Exactly.
Oh my gosh, Rachel, this has been I am so proud of you, first of all. And I learned so much today. This was such an enlightening conversation. I'd love to have you back on it's not a podcast, not a blog. I'd like to have you back at some point. But in the meantime, where can people catch you on social media? Where can they follow you if they want to know more about what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. On Instagram, just my first and last name, Rachael Balbarona. On Twitter, it's Rachael, but Rachael at the very end is with 2 A's and 4 E's. Rachel. Yes. That is emphasized because that's been spelled wrong all my life. And so you can go and find me there. Again, it's a lot of it is more so just like my mind spurts, little 400 characters on Twitter of just like, this is what I'm thinking right now, everyone, bye. But then it's also just like my day to day as well.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. We're going to hop off Facebook, but this will be posted on YouTube later, and we'll edit out the part where our Zoom froze. Thanks, everyone.